Welcome to the Useful Podcast. I'm your host, Gokul. And let me tell you this about today's guest, because I don't even think his students know the half of it. He holds a bachelor's, a master's, and a PhD in computer and electrical engineering from Queens. His doctoral research was on artificial neural networks and evolutionary algorithms, which is to say he was building AI in the 1990s, much before the world has even known about it. His second company detected bacteria in municipal drinking water, and it was acquired by Veolia, the largest environmental services company on the planet. He's a named co-inventor on more than 17 US and international patents. Peter Gallant. Welcome to the show. So I just like to get
Yeah,
right into it.
sure.
I call this the Useful Podcast because it's supposed to be useful for me, useful for you, and useful for the listener in what some way, shape, or form. Generally, the structure of this is just kind of like an interview style kind of questions, and mostly just for us to learn about you, your story, and how everything links together. I think every founder has an interesting story, and it's always interesting to learn about the journey and how it created their philosophy, their worldview, and what they were building towards.
Yeah,
So
no
yeah,
pressure. Got to be useful though. Be good.
I think everything is useful. But I was kind of curious before everything, when did you know you wanted to, or how did you know you had to create a productivity system for you? Because I know you created Total Capture, but how did you even think you needed one? That
Yeah,
first
so
step.
that goes way back, and I've actually changed the name now. I call it Productive Patterns, but that goes way back to the early 2000s. So that goes way back to the almost the earliest parts of some of the entrepreneurial work that I was doing, and I realized pretty quickly that entrepreneurs have to wear lots of hats. You have to be focused on a lot of things. And as soon as, especially, you start working with either customers or you start hiring people, the amount of detail that you have to keep track of and the number of commitments you have to keep track of goes up exponentially. And you can't keep that all in your head. And that was the origins of the idea of total capture. But where I learned that was I was fortunate enough to be walking through a bookstore and I saw on a display a copy of David Allen's book, Getting Things Done. And wow, Getting Things Done, that's an attractive title. And so I picked up the book and I started reading it right there in the store. And the first page is what actually hooked me. It said it's possible to have an overwhelming number of things to do and still be productive with a clear head and a positive sense of relaxed control. And to me, that sealed the deal. I picked up that book, I devoured it over the next 24 hours, and it changed my life. It changed the way I manage myself. It changed the way I manage my business. It changed the way I manage my personal life. And it had a huge impact on me. So that was really the beginning of my productivity journey.
I mean, did you have a moment you were drowning in work before that you realized you needed something, or was it more just
Yeah.
like a general evolution?
Well, it's I don't know if there's an analogy. I was going to use the frog in the pot of boiling water analogy, but I don't think there's as easy an analogy of drowning. You go from like not drowning to drowning, but the reality is that it was building up because I'd made a number of commitments. I was starting my first startup while I was still trying to finish my PhD. So I was getting up every morning and going, "Hey, I haven't finished my PhD thesis, yet I've also got a business that I'm trying to launch." And so I had found myself and maybe constructed for myself a series of inherently conflicting priorities that I was trying to action on all the time. So all of a sudden, I woke up one day and I was getting more and more concerned about how much I had to do versus my ability to get things done. And literally, that was when I saw this book in the bookstore. And I think that idea of having the need to get things done on my mind is what, as soon as I saw the cover of that book, it's like, yeah, I got to have it. And then the rest kind of fell from there because I was busy and I was overcommitted and I was tired and I was getting a little run down and kind of getting discouraged in some ways.
Yeah, curious. Did the book or the method give you anything specific or something tangible for you to work with immediately?
Well, yeah, there's a couple of things immediately that you can implement once you read a book. And I guess my view on productivity, Gokul, is it's very personal. And I fully believe that everybody needs to design a system to manage their own productivity, entrepreneurial or not. And I'm sure we're going to talk about kind of more of my entrepreneurial journey in a few minutes. But what I recognized immediately was a fundamental idea that hit me like a ton of bricks. And that was I was managing the wrong thing. I was trying to manage my time. I was trying to block out my time in calendars. Whereas what I should have been managing was the commitments I was making. And I didn't have a lot of clarity about all of the things that I had already committed to and all the things that I was going to have to commit to if I wanted to be successful in my startup and still achieve other things in my personal and professional and academic life.
Makes sense. Is there anything you had to immediately unlearn then?
Yeah. So the first thing I had to unlearn immediately was I had to stop making commitments willy nilly, frivolously, anything coming at me. Oh, yeah, I can do that. Oh, yeah, I can do that. I can do a lot of things. Hey, yeah, you want to meet next week and discuss your business idea? Sure, I'm happy to. So I became very conscious of the commitments that I was making in the moment. I became very conscious and started looking carefully at the commitments I'd already made. And I freaked myself out when I did that. And then one of the other very simple rules in the Getting Things Done book is what's called the 2-minute rule. If something comes into your world, into your email inbox, or all of a sudden you become aware of something that somebody's asked you to do, if you can complete it entirely within 2 minutes, do it as soon as it shows up. And so if I get an email, and I'm working on emails right now, and I can compose a reply in 2 minutes, I instantly do it, get it out of my world. And that had a huge immediate impact on my productivity. But the rest took a long time to develop into the mature system that I have now. And that system was tested by the entrepreneurial experiences that I was having at the time and that I've had since.
So curious, if you think someone took your system and applied it directly to themselves, do you think they would be successful, or do you think someone would have to develop it for themselves each time?
Well, I mean, for example, the Getting Things Done book is completely self-contained. It's a fully detailed, specified system that you could learn, and it takes a while to learn it. And you can attend a seminar or a training session that's put on by companies like Crucial Learning, which is the Getting Things Done licensee in North America. You can do that, or you can watch lots of YouTube videos. You can read through and puzzle through the implementation in the book. Or you can sit there and say, you know what? I'm going to take some of the building blocks from methodologies like Getting Things Done, or I'm going to take some of the building blocks from other productivity thought leaders like Cal Newport and his book Deep Work, or A World Without Email, or Greg McEwen's Essentialism. And I'm going to develop my own productivity system. I think the key point is it doesn't matter whose system or ideas you adopt. I think the most important thing is, as an entrepreneur or almost any working professional these days, you need a system. You need a systematic approach to how you're going to engage in the work of entrepreneurship, the work of taking your startup ideas and turning them into reality. Or if you're just a working professional, same idea. You're a knowledge worker. You've got to make up and define your work, and then you've got to execute on it and get it done on the back end. Otherwise, you're going to have a whole bunch of open loops that just aren't closing, and that doesn't make you very effective to yourself or anybody else.
Makes sense. So then now I want to take it a bit forward to, I guess, your PhD and your schooling. You actually did electrical and computer engineering, and your research was on artificial neural networks, basically AI before AI. Kind
Yeah.
of curious that time. What was the research about? What were you really trying to do?
Yeah. So I did my bachelor's degree in electrical engineering at Queen's University. I graduated in 1991, and I'd worked as a research assistant for the department for a year or two before that. I loved electronics. I worked at Radio Shack before I went to electrical engineering. So I loved engineering. I loved designing things. I loved the creative process, and I liked solving engineering problems. And so I had the opportunity to do a master's degree that was with two supervisors. And what I was looking for, some of the initial papers on the idea of artificial neural networks, how to train them, how to design them, had just been published. This was the late 80s, 1987, 89, 90. And specifically, Geoffrey Hinton had just published his seminal work in training artificial neural networks using an algorithm called error backpropagation. And that was the first paper that I read that's like, hey, you can specify this black box that doesn't have to understand anything about the problem you're solving, and you can train it completely by examples from the data. So present a whole bunch of data on the front of the neural network, present the correct answer on the back of the neural network, and let the neural network learn and do the work. And I was not applying AI in the ways that we're seeing it applied now, which is large language models. This was all processing sequences of numbers. And so the first problem that I worked on was a problem that one of my supervisors had, which was how to detect patterns in the muscle electromyograms that amputees, when they tensed a muscle, you got a myoelectric signal, but how could you translate that into signals that could be used to control an artificial limb? So that was the first project that I worked on. I was looking for interesting problems that required you to process large volumes of time series numerical data into something useful. So my master's work was in controlling artificial limbs with neural networks and dealing with some of the problems that came along with that. What type of inputs do you present to the network? How big do you make the network? If you make it too big, it tends to memorize the training data and it doesn't generalize well to the testing data. If you make it too small, it doesn't give you enough different signals to be meaningful to control the limb. So that was I was looking for real world problems to apply AI to. And that was the first of several real world problems that I worked on at the beginning of the work that I was doing in AI.
Then what was the PhD about?
So halfway through my master's, I read a paper that was life-changing to me. It was a paper in the Journal of the Optical Society of America, written by another professor at Queen's who I'd never met. He was head of the department, was a very big department, never taken any of his courses, and that was Professor George Aiken. And he had been working on problems where he was trying to improve the resolution of ground-based astronomical telescopes. The big telescopes, for example, on Mauna Kea, like the Canada-France-Hawaii telescope, that were trying to image stars and other bodies in the universe, but are limited because all of the light that is coming and being gathered by the telescope travels hundreds of thousands, if not millions of light years undistorted, but then it gets distorted by the atmosphere right before it gets imaged. And so he had published a paper saying the atmospheric distortion process, which is the same process if you look down a hot road, it shimmers and it has that illusion almost of seeing a puddle of water, or you look up at a star at night and it twinkles. Well, he basically published a paper saying that twinkling was not random. And if something's not random, that means you can predict it. And so that became the next big problem that I worked on with AI. I convinced him to take me on as a PhD student, and I started applying artificial neural networks to problems in predicting atmospheric distortion, because if you can predict that distortion even in a very short time frame, you can create an adaptive optics system that can drive mirrors and correct for some of that distortion. And our findings were you could probably improve the resolution by a ground-based telescope by about 600% by using even very simple neural network architectures.
And then you also try to commercialize that research, right?
Yeah. And of course, what does everybody try to do when you start developing prediction systems? What does everybody try to predict? The financial markets, right? So my first startup was using some of my on-campus research off campus, which of course took me away from completing my PhD in a timely way. I went to my supervisor and said, hey, on campus, I'm going to be predicting atmospheric distortion. Off campus, I'm going to go and start taking a crack at the financial markets. And so to make a long story short, we developed neural network-based prediction systems that would take large volumes of transactional data on certain financial instruments and try to yield either short-term predictions of either the market direction or also the volatility of the markets. And so we combine that with a very disciplined set of heuristics or rules around when to trade, when to buy, when to sell. We applied that primarily to the futures market in the US, trading interest rate and currency futures on the Chicago Board of Trade, Chicago Mercantile Exchange. And I raised a pool of trading capital, and we actually had fully automated trading systems that we ran for a number of years, sometimes very successfully, but then as the market volatility and stuff changed, then there were times where we also had losses as well. And as it turns out, the markets are not overly predictable. And some of the predictability that we'd seen was an artifact of how the market data was recorded as well. But it was a fascinating experience and a fascinating time. And it was my first exposure to taking ideas that I was developing in academic research and trying to apply them to real world problems in the business context. So it was the beginning of a huge learning curve for me, even though ultimately we didn't make a ton of money trading financial markets with neural networks. But it was an AI analytics company in the 90s when people kind of weren't doing that as often.
Curious, what was the hardest part of really turning your research into a product?
I think the hardest thing to do was to start with the simplest possible form of a product that you were trying to create. Because when you're doing academic research, you tend to explore lots of different avenues, lots of different areas, but you can leave them kind of maybe less defined than they have to be if you're actually building a product that you or somebody else is trying to use and commercialize. And so you have to start getting real clarity beyond the kind of academic abstract clarity that can still get you, published in a paper. You need to start getting very clear about what you're trying to achieve, what's the product going to do, what's it going to look like, and most importantly, what's the value proposition? What are you actually trying to generate in terms of value? And that's got to be value that somebody's willing to pay for. That's the hard part.
Then what do you think was there anything you thought was like a big mistake you made the first time around?
Well, the list is huge, so I have to, we can pick some examples. I think remember my first startup, I was doing AI analytics, but I was doing that to trade our own capital account. And so I hadn't yet had the experience where I was building a product that somebody else was going to buy. So my first startup being AI analytics, that one ended up kind of morphing into a lifestyle business, but ultimately we took some of the capital from that business and used it to capitalize a second business called pathogen detection systems. And that business was very much more a product business. It was a system designed to detect bacteria in water. In the wake of, we'd had a water quality outbreak incident in Ontario in May of 2000, in which 7 people died and many thousands were made ill. And a group of researchers at Queen's had developed a way of automating microbiological testing for harmful bacteria in drinking water, such as E. coli and total coliform bacteria. And so I had taught a course with one of these professors because I was teaching courses at the same time as doing my PhD and working off campus because, again, too many commitments. But this one worked out well because this professor introduced me to the rest of the group of professors who were doing the research. And I pulled them together and said, hey, how are you going to commercialize this? The outcome of research, in my view, shouldn't just be papers that go and get published in academic journals. You need to build products that impact the real world. And this was a huge opportunity to do that, was to develop a product that would replace laboratory testing where a sample would have to be shipped to a laboratory and 48 or 72 or even longer hours later, you would get an indication that the water had been contaminated and you shouldn't have consumed it 3 days ago. It's not a very useful indication. And so the system that these professors had envisioned with their research, and they had done proof of concept in the lab, was a fully automated system you could reduce down to the size of a microwave oven that could be run right at the point of testing. So the water sample could be obtained immediately at the water plant or in the distribution system, which is the network of pipes where the water moves between the water plant and our tap. And then you could put those samples on test immediately. And instead of waiting 24 or 48 hours for the results, an optical system could continuously monitor the sample And as soon as it detected an indication of bacteria, it could ring the alarm in as little as 2 hours. And so back to that idea of value proposition, I clearly saw the value proposition in rapidly accelerating drinking water testing. I thought that was a product that could be useful to the world. We could use it to test drinking water. Maybe we could test water on beaches because beaches are tested for E. coli contamination as well. And so maybe naively, I thought there would be a very smooth product path to develop this product idea. So I brought the group of professors together and said, hey, if I were in your shoes, this is how I would go about commercializing this. And to make a long story short, they said, well, if you want to have a crack at it, then I became the founding CEO of Pathogen Detection Systems, and we ended up building those systems.
So what was it like building a product based on research? It's like you knew what you needed, but it's still a lot of unknown territory, right?
Yeah. So when I first got involved in this technology, the proof of concept had been done with a number of tests in petri dishes. And the problem with that is there was a very long development path between being able to go and create the test in a lab and run the test and demonstrated that it worked in theory. But then how were we going to translate that to a robust product that could be used with a single-use test cartridge, because that was not only for making the product viable, that also enabled us to use a unique-ish business model, which was kind of like the razor blade or the inkjet printer business model, right? You could have a testing system that you then had single-use test cartridges. You had recurring revenue, right, from those test cartridges. So I could see a business model that looked really good, but the challenge was to take the test itself from being created in a lab, all the reagents being in liquid form, being mixed up by a laboratory technician, and then run essentially in a petri dish on a laboratory desktop. How do you convert that technology into a single-use cartridge with a 1-year minimum shelf life that could survive transportation, could survive temperature variations, and then could be run by a non-laboratory technician, a water operator in the field? And so there was a big transition between that. And that was an exciting part of that business.
That makes sense. And what was like I guess you explained how it's broken. I'm kind of curious when you got acquired then by, was it Volia?
Veolia. So
Veolia. Yeah.
we'd been at this for a number of years. We'd raised angel and a first round of Series A of venture capital. But to really grow the business, and one of the things that I had learned along the way was you can't just build a system to test water. People have to believe that those tests are sensitive enough and selective enough that they are properly detecting the target bacteria. And they don't just take your word for it. In fact, in every jurisdiction around the world, especially drinking water, is heavily regulated. And the regulators actually require certain approved tests to be run on drinking water. So you had to get the test approved. And we were fortunate in that we were able to get our automated testing system approved by the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for drinking water testing. So a municipality could use it to comply with its drinking water testing obligations. But that approval happened after we were acquired. The process, the timeline, the amount of cost required to get approvals, both in the US, Canada, and ultimately in other jurisdictions worldwide, was significant, especially the time required to get all those approvals. And so we had raised our Series A capital, but we were going to have to raise $10 or $12 million in Series B, but we were going into 2008. And there was no way we were going to raise capital during the economic downturn from the subprime mortgage crisis. Venture capitalists simply stopped investing. The IPO window was closed. And so we went out and looked for strategic partners, and all the major water testing organizations around the world, companies that manufactured different kinds of tests or were involved in water quality testing, a lot of them came and looked at our technology, and several became quite interested in it. And so the path stopped being raising venture capital and start looking for a strategic partner. And as it turned out, one of these potential strategic partners, Veolia, the world's largest environmental services company, simply acquired the company. But it was acquired, for relatively low acquisition value. It wasn't a retirement level event for me or any of the shareholders, but that I stayed with the Veolia group after the acquisition because that gave us the resources and the ability to take this technology out through the approval process and get it deployed out in the real world. And so I loved working with Veolia. It's a very interesting company. It's hundreds of thousands of people across many business units doing business in 60 countries. So it kind of blew me into a whole new world of the sales and distribution and marketing side. And also, one of the opportunities that I had when I was with the Veolia group was looking at other new innovative technologies that could enhance the competitive advantage of some products that in the water industry, it's a very slow moving industry. Some of these products have been around for decades and there's not much kind of competitive advantage built into these products. And adding some technology or some smart features to an existing product could make it much more competitive. So I worked on a number of projects within the Veolia group working on that. So that was really exciting. I felt like I was kind of an intrapreneur in a large company that had tremendous reach and huge numbers of customers all around the world.
That is interesting, actually. Then, kind of curious, since you're working with a lot of different water companies, a lot of different patents, a lot of different approval systems, regulations must be like up to the neck on all of them.
Yeah.
Kind of curious what it takes to actually deal with regulators on a day to day. Like how many businesses actually die before they even get to a regulator, or there's probably a lot of these things you see in these types of industries, right?
Yeah. And it's a very specialized area. In fact, literally I changed my title to VP of Business Development and Regulatory Affairs specifically because I spent so much of my time dealing with regulators, and a lot of regulations had never contemplated the idea that you could run a microbiology test for drinking water outside an accredited microbiology lab. And so there were lots of different implications. There are lots of different approval systems around the world. There is no one unified approval that one agency approves your technology and all of a sudden everybody in the world can use it. So it was literally jurisdiction by jurisdiction. I spent a lot of time with the US EPA looking at their testing protocols, running the tests on our systems, and also uh, explaining why our systems were performing and producing results that were different from laboratory tests, because our system was actually more sensitive to bacteria than some of the existing lab tests. And so that made our system look like it was perhaps generating too many false positives. So there was a lot of really interesting work to do, both technical work, but also just the sheer human interaction that
The
you have to
education,
do
right?
to engage and build confidence in people who are responsible for making some of these decisions on the regulatory side. Plus, also, I spent a lot of my time in business development mode going into potential customers and explaining our technology and how it could add value. And that was a very rewarding part of my career.
Curious how you dealt with regulators in different jurisdictions.
Yeah, I mean, every jurisdiction has its own regulations. A lot of jurisdictions have their own way of testing a new technology. Some are far more open to it than others. But what I found is there's a couple of regulators that are so credible, like the US EPA, that if you're able to get their approval, that certainly opens the door in other jurisdictions as well. But the market was largely closed to this technology without those regulatory approvals. And that was something that wasn't aware of, didn't know about very much when I first looked at the technology, but it was one of those hidden challenges at the beginning of an entrepreneurial journey.
Yes. So you're also the co-inventor and on more than 17 different patents. And you're the CEO of WaterTap. So what was it like? I mean, WaterTap is Ontario's largest I mean, water innovation agency and you were reporting to a minister. But what was it really like moving from more like a founder, a business, academia to directly almost like government agency?
Yeah, it was interesting because I had started off in doing graduate level research. I never really intended to get a PhD for academic reasons. I did a PhD as to do something hard and lonely as entrepreneurial training, right? So because I think you need entrepreneurs always need to challenge themselves, and a lot of your drive as an entrepreneur needs to come from within rather than external accountability or external reward systems or external motivation. So I found my PhD was very effective at making me drive myself. So that was mission accomplished there. Then transitioning into running startups. Running startups is very challenging. I enjoyed that time. At the same time, I'd gone through the entire process of having started a couple of startups and with pathogen detection systems all the way through to an acquisition and then staying with the acquirer. And then I got the experience of working for that large multinational corporation. So I really enjoyed that time as well. And one of the things that appealed to me about making that change was I'd had 5 years. There was a lot of travel involved. I still had young kids at home. And at the same time, I wanted to get back to working with entrepreneurs and entrepreneurial ideas. And so the province of Ontario, through what's called the Water Opportunities Act, had created an innovation accelerator for a 5-year period for the drinking water and wastewater industry. I was on the board originally, but then the opportunity came up when the previous CEO left the organization. I applied for the job to become the CEO. And because what appealed to me there was a combination of me being able to use some of that policy and regulatory expertise that was hard won, spent a lot of time and energy learning. I was able to combine that with working with other entrepreneurs who were developing really interesting technologies in the water industry that could obviously be impactful globally. And a lot of entrepreneurs in the water industry are what I call technologists turned entrepreneur. So they understand the technology well, but where they run into challenges is with attracting customers, designing products, and raising capital. Because when I typically coach them before they go and pitch a venture capital fund, we start with a 60 slide deck, of which 59 of those slides are how the technology works. And by the time we finish massaging that slide deck, they have a much better presentation about what the market opportunity is, what the potential product is, what's the value proposition, what critical unmet need are we solving, how much of this product can we build and where can we sell it and how much money can we make in 5 years, which are the things the venture capitalists have to understand to be able to invest in the company. So I got really good at packaging technical ideas in non-technical ways. And that was something that had been kind of a through line in a lot of the work that I'd done at Veolia. And so for me, it was a logical transition. I got to work with entrepreneurs without running another startup myself because I'd promised my wife I'd take a break from running startups for a while. At the same time, I got to work with a lot of interesting technologies, a lot of really committed amazing entrepreneurs. That organization had a time limit because it was only funded for a number of years from the provincial government, but it was a great initiative. And so near the end of my time there, I was about to turn 50, and that for me was a kind of a major decision point. And so I worked with a professional coach for a year on the transition and the question being, what should I do next? I'm 50. What's next?
Wow. And by when you were 50, I'm kind of curious, just what did your resume look like? Was it a PhD, two startups, an exit, a bunch of these extra things happening? And
Yeah.
you're still teaching at this time, right? So,
Yeah, and I'd been teaching the odd course. I originally started teaching engineering courses, but then for about maybe the 7 or 8 years before that, I had been teaching in the business school. I'd been teaching an introductory entrepreneurship and investing course, taking those skills that I'd learned in the real world about dealing with investors and packaging and explaining technical ideas in non-technical ways. I'd been recruited into teaching about a course a year in the business school.
yeah. So, Do you think your, I guess I want to tie it back to your productivity system or your productivity because I think it sounds like you've been doing a lot over the past, I guess, since you were 25. So the last 25 years since you were 25 to 50 and before you even got to that point. So how do you think your productivity system actually helped you?
I think a lot of people that want to do a lot of things, have a lot of ideas, maybe have a lot of personal ambition. If I were to sit down with somebody and say, "Hey, how would you rate yourself out of 10 on a scale of productivity?" A lot of people who are kind of, go-getters and ambitious by nature, if they're honest with themselves, will probably still rate themselves a 6, 7, or maybe an 8 out of 10 in their productivity. And they realize that they've kind of kludged together their own practices. And if you ask them to sit down and explain to somebody else or to yourself, what is your system? Do you have a system? Do you have a consistent way of managing yourself, your time, the things that you're responsible for? A lot of people will say, ew, I don't want a system because I don't want to be a robot and I don't want to be working all the time. There's some kind of standard objections to the system. But if you spend a couple of minutes with them and understand what they do on a daily or a weekly basis, what is their practice around productivity? A lot of people do have some pretty basic systems. For example, all of us probably are pretty used to using a calendar. That's how you and I arranged to meet this afternoon. But a lot of us, when we see a commitment that is time-based, we've kind of conditioned ourselves to put it into our calendar. So I think a lot of people have the basics down, but then you start looking at all of the opportunities for somebody who is wanting to do a lot of things, has a lot of interest, has a lot of capacity to get things done. How much have they invested in building that capacity to be productive versus simply sitting down and being productive? And you spend a couple of minutes with somebody about, hey, what are your systems? How are you managing yourself? Do you think you could become more productive? Usually what happens is the light goes on and they're like, yeah, wow, I haven't spent a lot of time thinking about how I manage myself and my productivity. I just work on things and get them done. And that's where for the last 10 or 12 years in my role as a adjunct professor in the business school, what I started to do was every year I started to offer a bonus lecture to my students on personal productivity. And the question is, how are you going to manage yourself personally and professionally for the next 100 years? How are you going to manage yourself in a sustainable way, not burn out, and still get the things done that are going to be meaningful to you? And so that had an impact on a fair number of students. And I was getting feedback going, wow, I hadn't thought of this. I hadn't thought about developing a systematic, consistent way of managing myself. And when I look back over my entrepreneurial career, that was critical in making sure that I was able to step back and figure out, hey, here are the things that I really have to focus on. And then here are the specific actions that are going to let me move forward in the various projects that are related to those areas of focus. And so for me, it had a huge impact. And so I've been working with students who have taken any of my other courses. They get to come to this bonus lecture that is outside the curriculum. It's completely optional. And it was generating a lot of interest and a lot of thought. So one of the things that I'm working on now is yet another, I guess, entrepreneurial idea is taking some of those ideas and designing a methodology that entrepreneurs or recent graduates or people who are professionals and want to get better at their productivity can actually learn how to design their own unique productivity system using the building blocks that are already out there and putting them together in a way that works for them. And so I call that productive patterns.
When do you know when you're planning to come out with that? Or
Yeah, so I did a whole bunch of interviews over the last year, and I've been working with a colleague of mine on developing the curriculum, developing the launch plan, and I'll be launching the first initial cohort of this just to a group of beta users in mid-September. of this year of 2026. So it's coming up in about a month and a half. And
Yeah,
so I've
that's
got lots
exciting.
of things to finish to get that done. And then that's going to be a kind of a prototype of the course. I'm going to run it with a small group of beta students. There still are a couple of spots available for people to participate in the beta. But then all of the feedback, I'm going to deliver the sessions live over 10 weeks with an option to simply watch the recording. But then after that, I'm going to take all of the feedback from the beta, refine the program, add some additional content that I'm really itching to get into the program as well. And then I'm going to launch a full asynchronous version of the program in around January 10th of 2027.
Okay, so next year it's coming up.
Yeah. But
That's
this fall,
exciting.
in fact, I'm doing the beta launch in about 6 weeks. So
Yeah, and now that takes me to my next question. Why teaching? I know teaching something probably helps you learn something in a better manner, but you've gotten to teaching for a long time now. So curious what made that shift and why you like teaching.
yeah, I think part of it is if you want to learn something, then understand it well enough to teach it really does help you. But also, when I turned 50, I actually worked with a professional coach for a year in that transition. I'd been doing some work with the financial independence early retirement community. And what I did is I worked with a coach in that community to look a little bit at what the kind of financial strategies I could use leading into retirement. So I use an approach called Coast Financial Independence. So basically, I've already saved for my conventional retirement. Now, basically, I can simply have to make my expenses between now and any conventional retirement date. But through those discussions, I also realized that I'm really not interested in retiring. What I'm really interested in is designing a life that I would never really want to retire from. And that includes a couple of elements. And so the work that I did with my coach over that year, a lot of those discussions were focused not on the financial part, but what my vision of a long-term sustainable collection of meaningful work, meaningful projects could I be involved in that I could do for decades into my 60s and 70s and whenever. And so that's where I came up with this mix of things that I wanted to work on. And one of the questions that my coach asked me was, what are the through lines in your life? What are the things that are highly consistent in your life? And one of them was I like teaching things. I was a teaching assistant when I was in grad school. I'd obviously taught at the university for a number of years as well. When I'm not teaching things at the university, sometimes I'm teaching my hobbies. So that was a big through line. And so from that perspective, I knew that was going to be part of the mix of things that I wanted to do. And one of the secrets of transitioning to some sort of semi-retirement is maybe not necessarily going and having a huge list of new things you want to learn, as opposed to having perhaps a couple of new things. But what are you already really good at that you really like and you want to keep doing for a long time? And so that was a big part of it. And so I had a great opportunity to join the business school as a continuing adjunct. I now am tenured on the teaching side. I have some administrative responsibilities as well, but I don't have any research responsibilities. And so I can teach as many or as few courses as I want and feather that into the mix of other things that I want to do. Create an off-campus productivity course. Or, for example, I upgraded my private pilot's license that I'd had since the 1990s. I upgraded that with a multi-engine rating and an instrument rating so I can fly in clouds and in maybe a little bit more difficult weather conditions, which provides more flexibility for flying. And even that experience was inspired by somebody who was my instructor, who was a former F-18 and starfighter pilot, 75 years old, and was still flying, sharp as a tack. And I learned a ton from him as my instructor. And so that's what I kind of aspired to, was being active into your 60s and 70s and potentially beyond, and doing things that interest you. And so not only was I able to learn and upgrade my pilot's license, I also had an example of somebody who was still doing that in their 70s. And that was really inspiring to me.
Curious. I know a lot of people turning 50 and it's almost like a midlife crisis, or it's almost they're going through a transition in their life and they don't really know what's going on. I'm kind of
Yeah.
curious what your advice to them would be.
It was interesting because I don't know if I've had a midlife crisis, although if you ask my wife, I'm sure she would give you a different answer. But from that perspective, one of the things that hit me hard as I was kind of heading into my 50s, and I was actually at a conference where somebody gave a really interesting talk. And basically, they'd given a timeline, put a timeline up on the screen that had birth, death in the middle, and it had one other dot marked enough. And the question that the speaker, who was a great speaker, posed was, what is enough for you? Do you have enough? Do you feel you have enough? But more importantly, not only do you feel that you have enough, do you feel that you are enough? And as it turns out, and I really fundamentally believe this, I think a lot of human fears and fears around aging and fears that especially in men, I think trigger that midlife crisis type response are actually fear. And I think we alternate between two fears. I think we alternate between the fear of not having enough and the fear of not being enough. And if I look back into my own patterns, I realized for me that is true. Sometimes I worried, I wasn't going to have enough. I would never be able to retire or save or buy a house, which is a lot harder for this generation than it was for the last one. But then a lot of my fears were also about not being enough, not achieving the things that I not only had set out to do, but I also think were representative of fulfilling my destiny on the planet, for lack of a better word. Right. And I really believe that we're responsible for where we place our energy, what to focus on, the commitments we've made, the people in our lives that we've committed to, either a spouse or I have 2 children. So I think those are all important things. And so for me, a lot of that around turning 50 was embracing that fear of not having enough and not being enough. And don't get me wrong, I haven't overcome that. I still feel that and alternate between the two once in a while. But reconciling that against, hey, I probably have still several decades of really important, productive work ahead of me. Where am I going to place that focus and where am I going to place that energy? And for me, that's made all the difference. And it was one of the best decisions I ever made, was to actually embrace that and say, I don't have to work full time anymore. I don't have to become the CEO of a major corporation. I want to free myself up to do my best work, and investing in my own productivity system means that when I define what that best work is, I know I can actually achieve it and get it done, right? Because too many people have unfulfilled ideas. They have ideas, some people have notebooks full of ideas, Gokul, where they've got all these great ideas, but they never fulfill them or complete them. And I'm guilty of that too. But what I'm trying to do is reduce the number of ideas that I have and let them sit for a while until they've really kind of percolated and matured, but then decide whether or not I'm going to commit to them or not. If I'm not going to commit to them, I let myself off the hook. Maybe I'll think about them next year. But for the ideas that I'm committing to, I'm really trying to focus on moving them forward. And for this year, for example, that's the productivity stuff I'm working on.
Interesting. And that makes sense as well. So the other thing is also you've been a pilot, a private pilot, and like you mentioned, kind of curious, what did learning to fly actually teach you about anything? Or is there anything that it taught you differently?
Yeah, I think a whole bunch of things. I mean, I always loved the idea of flying. I'd flown flight simulators when I was a kid. I'm afraid of heights and I'm afraid of roller coasters, but I'm never really afraid of heights in a plane as long as there's something around me. But put me up on a ladder 15 feet high and I'm not very happy. So for me, it was about learning to get good at a skill, which I think was important. But as you're learning how to fly, first of all, I think the role of your flight instructor is basically to keep you from killing yourself until you teach yourself how to fly. But I had a really great primary instructor who really did teach me quite well. You learn the theory, you learn the procedures and things like that. But at some point, when you first start learning how to fly or learn any kind of complex skill, all of the individual pieces of those skills are still kind of on their own, right? They're not integrated. But then one day, after you've practiced enough, everything starts to come together, and you stop thinking about moving the control column or the yoke or the stick or whatever you've got in front of you to bank the plane and climb and the engine and everything else. And those things start to kind of flow together, and you start flying more smoothly. But also, it's kind of like learning how to drive a car in a way. After a while, you stop thinking about the driving part, and then you can start focusing on the road and what's coming up ahead of you and anticipating what's going to happen down the road and where am I and navigating and all that stuff. So it's interesting. You start with the basic skills, but then as you get more familiar and those skills get integrated, you start thinking about higher and higher level things. And so when you start flying multi-engine aircraft, when you start getting an instrument rating, just like the airlines where you can fly in clouds and you fly the instrument landing systems down to runways, a lot of that is not about the pull this knob and push this button. It's about systems, and it's about procedures, and it's about maintaining your situational awareness. So what I learned from all that was, as an entrepreneur, you're kind of, you're in it on a daily basis. You're doing all these things, and once in a while, be able to step back, go to a higher perspective, and say, "Hey, I now see how all these things go together." And especially when you're flying, you have to be able to say, "Hey, where am I? Am I at a safe altitude? Am I following the right procedures? Am I on the right course? Am I approaching the airport correctly? Are all of my systems working properly?" And we spend a lot of time in emergency procedures. One of the things I learned about myself is that I don't panic in emergencies. And so both simulated, I've had a couple of actual in-flight minor emergencies that I stayed calm and I thought through them and worked through them in a calm way rather than panicking. So that reinforced my confidence in other aspects of my life, but it was one of the things that I think I learned from that experience.
The other thing is with a pilot, especially with piloting or flying, it's one of those skills you can't really practice for, and you can only really practice for when you're in the plane. So you must not have had a lot of time to practice. How do you learn a system or gain a skill without being able to, I guess, live jump in a cockpit every so often?
Well, I mean, first of all, I don't think you have to learn how to fly from just flying a plane, although, of course, that's the most realistic way to do it. A lot of times, the first things that you're doing, you don't just kind of jump in the plane and learn to fly. You're doing some ground school, you're doing some simulations. There are a lot of incredible simulators now that are very realistic that you do. And in fact, when I go and do my recurring training, some of the simulators that I fly are so realistic that I can log the time in my logbook as part of my recurring training. So you can also, in a simulator, they can put you in situations that are too dangerous to train on in the aircraft, like an engine failure right after pulling off the runway. Or the last recurring training session I did, I flew an approach into Telluride, Colorado with mountains all around the airport, which of course we don't have mountains where we are here in Eastern Ontario. So I think a simulator can put you into more challenging situations, but it removes that kind of personal danger element. The other things that people do, not just in aviation, but in other professional training environments, is visualization. So in flying, we call that chair flying. Sitting there and envisioning all of the things that you're going to do when you get into the aircraft and going over that in your mind. And so a lot of that you can do on the ground. And a lot of pilots who are well trained also use envisioning, even when they're actually just about to go flying. So one of the last things that I do and my instructor trained me to do was, as I'm about to pull onto a runway, okay, am I on the right runway? What's the departure procedure? What am I doing as soon as the plane takes off? Am I flying runway heading? Am I turning? I'm talking to air traffic control. Have I got all those frequencies set up? But most importantly, envisioning, if the engine fails as soon as I take off, what am I going to do? Right? If I'm not off the runway by a certain point on the runway and the plane's not accelerating perhaps as well as it should, maybe there's a problem with the engine, what am I going to do? And so envisioning those things, and we say them out loud. If I'm not off by the 3,000-foot marker or the 1,000-foot marker of the airport, I'm going to pull the throttle back, step on the brakes, and abort the takeoff. So I think you can envision things before you do them. And I think envisioning is a big part of not only of a lot of professional training and effectiveness. I think for entrepreneurs, I think visioning is absolutely critical.
It makes sense. And since we're coming right up to the end,
Yeah.
this is a little bit of my favorite question. So you've been a founder, an executive, a CEO, and a professor. Throughout all of it, what was the happiest season of your life?
The happiest season of my life. I mean, I think I've gone through seasons that alternate from kind of euphoria to panic and everywhere in between. There are certainly some moments in your personal and professional life that, of course, stand out. Notwithstanding my personal life, the best days of my life were when I got married, of course, to my wife, but also the birth of my two amazing kids. But when we talk about professional things, for me, I think the first time that somebody bought one of my products that I had actually had a big role in designing, for me, that was a magical day because somebody recognized the value of what we were doing and was willing to pay for it. And so I think in an entrepreneurial journey, I think it's not the day that you incorporate the company. I mean, anybody can do that. It's not the day that you go and raise venture capital because that means you were just handed the tools to do the job. But the day that you build something that somebody buys, or the day that your business gets big enough that it's cash flow positive and it's starting to turn into a profitable business, those are exciting times in the time of an entrepreneur. Or the first time you're able to hire somebody and provide employment to other people, I think that's an exciting time as well. So I think there's certainly been some great highlights there. There's certainly been many nights of dark nights of the soul, and I could have done this and I should have done this, and second guessing myself. But at the end of the day, those are all part of the journey. They're all part of the entrepreneurial game. Entrepreneurship is not without risk. And I think it's how you react to risk that has an impact on your ability to be successful and perform as an entrepreneur.
And taking it all the way back then, what would you tell I guess, a bachelor's version of yourself looking back that was still, or I guess, master's when you're still studying neural networks and everything? What would you want to tell yourself back then?
Yeah, I would tell myself that AI is going to take a while to catch on, but when it does, it's going to be really huge. I would have told myself to buy Google. And although I had invested in Sun Microsoft, Dell, Oracle, and Intel in the 90s, that wasn't bad, but, buy Bitcoin. But
Yeah.
beyond the,
Oh my gosh.
beyond the obvious funny things, I think the thing that I probably would have told myself was spend more time focusing on a very small number of the most important things. It's not what your website looks like. It's not what your logo looks like. There are only a couple of things that in any business have to be completely true to maximize the success potential of any business. And there's three that I'd probably talk about. One is you've got to have a value proposition that you're delivering real value to somebody in the marketplace. You got to understand what that value is and why that's valuable to somebody. So that's the first thing. Second of all, you got to understand who your customer is, right? Who your markets are, who your customers are. Put those together. Now you're delivering value to a very specific qualified customer. And the third thing is then when you figured out that value proposition and you figured out who that customer is, the last thing you got to do is execute, is properly develop the product, do the things that you need to do and your team need to do to properly build out that product and get it in the hands of a customer and engage them and get their feedback until that customer is 100% satisfied. You're not a proxy for your customer. I used to think, oh, I knew what my customer would want. Some of the things, our most innovative ideas from the product perspective came from people who actually used our products, not from what we thought they wanted, but from them actually telling us what they wanted and how they use their products.
Yeah, I guess that makes sense. And I guess that's a perfect place to actually end it. But thanks so much, Peter, that you spent a whole year teaching me and I learned so much. And I guess I'll just stop it right here for recording.